The back room of Flint's saloon reeked of cheap whiskey, stale sweat, and a thick, suffocating fear. Mai's wrists were bound with coarse rope, the rough fibers digging into her skin, leaving angry red welts that burned with every slight movement. Beside her, her younger sister, Shia, crouched on the dusty floorboards. She was so small, so fragile, shaking with a terror so profound she could barely draw a breath. Flint towered over them, a monument of cruel indifference. A smile, thin and predatory, twisted his lips. In the corner, his man, Cole, leaned against the wall, idly flipping a wicked-looking knife. His grin was a mirror of his boss's, but wider, more eager, revealing teeth stained yellow by tobacco. 2 men, 2 looming shadows, and for the sisters, no hope of escape. Their father had run a small laundry at the edge of town, working his fingers to the bone until a fever took him swiftly, leaving his daughters with nothing but his meager possessions and a staggering debt to this man. A debt Flint had no intention of letting them repay with coin. "You can't pay me in silver," Flint growled, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floor. "So you'll pay me in flesh." Mai's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the suffocating silence. Her mouth was a desert, her lips cracked and split from the backhanded slap he had already given her for daring to protest. She stole a glance at Shia, whose terrified eyes, wide and shimmering with unshed tears, were fixed on her. They were a silent, desperate plea. Her sister was only 18, a blossom barely opened, far too young to be withered by this nightmare. Flint's meaty hand shot out, grabbing Mai by the upper arm and yanking her to her feet. His breath, hot and foul with whiskey, washed over her cheek. He was enjoying this, savoring their fear like a fine meal. "You or her," he sneered, his gaze flicking to the trembling girl on the floor. His thumb traced the line of the rope on Shia's bound arm. "It's your choice." A small, choked whimper escaped Shia's lips. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated terror, and it shattered the last remnants of Mai's defiance. She couldn't let him touch Shia. She couldn't. The weight of shame, heavy and cold, crushed her chest, making it impossible to breathe. She closed her eyes, picturing her father's kind face, begging his spirit for forgiveness. She forced her voice out, a trembling, broken whisper that was barely audible. "I took it off. Please, just let her go." The words hung in the air, thick with sacrifice and despair. She was not naked. Not yet. But in that moment, she felt stripped bare, her pride, her dignity, her very soul laid out on the grimy floor of this back room. She had surrendered her body to protect the only family she had left in this harsh, unforgiving land. "No!" Shia cried out, her voice cracking as she strained against her bonds. "Mai, don't! Please, somebody, help us!" Her cry was thin and reedy, but it pierced through the thin wooden walls of the saloon, a desperate prayer sent out into the indifferent night. In the front room, Arthur Hayes heard it. He hadn't come to town for trouble. He had come for a pouch of tobacco and a quiet drink, a brief respite from the solitude of his ranch and the ghosts that haunted it. He was a man who kept to himself, his temples shot with grey, his shoulders stooped from decades of hard labor and harder memories. But the sound that reached him now was not just a woman's cry for help. It was an echo. A chilling echo of a past he had spent 10 long years trying to bury. His Sarah had screamed like that. Just before the flash of gunfire, just before the cold silence of the grave. Arthur set his whiskey glass down on the bar. The clink of glass on wood was unnaturally loud in the suddenly quiet room. He rose slowly, his movements deliberate, his worn leather boots heavy against the floorboards. The piano man's fingers froze over the keys. The few grizzled prospectors and weary-eyed drunks at the bar glanced up, a ripple of unease disturbing their alcoholic stupor. He pushed through the swinging door into the back, and the scene that greeted him froze him where he stood. Mai, her simple dress torn at the shoulder, her eyes a swirling vortex of despair and resignation. Shia, tied and sobbing, her face a mask of youthful terror. Flint, looming over them like a vulture, his hand still clamped on Mai's arm. And Cole, smirking from the corner, the lamplight glinting off the edge of his knife. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. The room tilted, the flickering light blurring at the edges. For a single, gut-wrenching heartbeat, he was not in a saloon in the year 1888. He was back on that cold, moonless night 10 years ago. He could smell the gunpowder, see the terror in his daughter's eyes as she begged for a help that came too late. His jaw tightened, the muscle jumping in his cheek. His fingers, long accustomed to the feel of reins and plow handles, twitched near the worn Colt revolver resting at his hip. Flint snarled when he noticed him, breaking the spell. "This ain't your business, old man. Turn around and walk away." Arthur did not move. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, locked on Mize. He saw the silent plea written there, the desperate hope warring with utter hopelessness. He saw a woman ready to sacrifice everything, a sister prepared to lay down her life for her family. The air in the room grew thick, charged, ready to shatter at the slightest provocation. Arthur's heart pounded like a war drum against his ribs. He had sworn an oath over a small, lonely grave. Never again. Never to draw, never to kill. But here it was, the same hellish choice, the same terrible question, dressed in a different time and place. Would he walk away and let history repeat its cruel, bloody cycle? Or would Arthur Hayes, the man who had lost everything, finally act to save two broken sisters from the same fate? He stood there, a statue carved from grief and regret, his eyes fixed on the two young women. The whole room seemed to hold its breath. Flint's hand tightened on Mize's arm, his grin returning, laced with arrogance. "You heard me, old man. I said walk away." Still, Arthur did not move. His jaw was a knot of iron. His hand drifted closer, a fraction of an inch, to the revolver on his hip. The years of rust that had settled over his soul began to crack, flaking away to reveal the hard steel beneath. The weight of every choice he had ever made, every failure, every loss, pressed down on him, threatening to buckle his knees. Mai looked at him, her eyes begging, her lips trembling. No sound came out. She had spent all her strength, given everything she had just to keep Shea safe. Flint let out a sharp, cruel laugh. "This one's already offered herself up. A real sweet little flower. Said she took it off for me. What a brave sister," he leered at Shea. "Maybe I'll take the young one after, just to be fair about the debt." Shea cried out again, a raw, desperate sound, kicking futilely at the ropes around her ankles. "Please, mister, don't let him. Please." That cry snapped something deep inside Arthur. It was like thunder rolling through his chest, like a lightning strike to a dead tree. In one fluid, deceptively smooth motion, his revolver cleared its worn leather holster, the blued steel gleaming under the flickering lamplight. The sharp, metallic click of the hammer being pulled back was louder than any gunshot. It was the sound of a promise being broken to keep a more important one. Cole froze, his knife still half raised, his smirk vanishing as if wiped away by an invisible hand. Flint's grin faltered, his face twitching with a sudden, unwelcome fear. No one in that room, not the bully, not the henchman, not the two terrified sisters, doubted for a second that Arthur Hayes meant to use that gun. "Untie them." Arthur's voice was low, steady, and as cold as a grave. It carried more weight than any shout. It was not a request. It was the law. For a long moment, Flint hesitated, his beady eyes darting between the unwavering barrel of Arthur's revolver and Mai's trembling body. He was a big man, used to getting his way through brute force and intimidation. But he wasn't a fool. Folks in this town still whispered about Arthur Hayes, the quiet rancher who had been a soldier in a forgotten war, the man who was said to have never missed a shot he intended to make. Flint's bravado cracked. With a vile curse spat between his teeth, he fumbled with the knots, yanking the rope loose from the sister's wrists. Cole, seeing his boss fold, took a hasty step back, his knife clattering to the floor. The moment she was free, Mai stumbled forward, her knees weak, and pulled Shea into her arms. They clung to each other, their bodies shaking in unison, tears of relief and terror carving clean paths down their dirt-streaked faces. For the first time that night, a tiny, fragile sliver of hope pierced through the darkness. Arthur kept his revolver steady, his eyes never leaving the two men. He knew better than to lower it too soon. Men like Flint only understood the hard, uncompromising language of steel. "Get out of here," he said, his voice even colder than before. "Both of you." Humiliated and seething, Flint spat on the floor. He backed toward the door, his eyes promising retribution. Cole scurried after him, a shadow full of hate. Before disappearing into the main room, Flint hissed, "This ain't over. You'll pay for this, old man." The door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a warning. Silence, thick and heavy, filled the room once more. Mai turned to Arthur, her own voice breaking with a mix of awe and confusion. "Why? Why would you help us? You don't even know who we are." Arthur slowly holstered his gun, the simple action seeming to drain the last of his energy. His eyes were heavy, clouded with memories too painful to speak aloud. He looked at the two sisters, so young, so vulnerable, and saw the ghost of his own daughter standing beside them. Instead of answering her question directly, he only muttered, "Because someone should have helped my daughter." And nobody did. Mai blinked, the weight of his words settling on her. She didn't understand, not fully, but she understood the pain behind them. She clung to her sister, whispering through her tears, "Are we safe now, Mai? Are we safe?" Arthur's gaze hardened again. He looked toward the door, Flint's threat still hanging in the air like poison. "Safe," he said, his voice grim. "Not even close. Flint is a coward, but a coward with power and friends in this town. And men like that, they never let go." What would happen when he came back? Not with just one man, but with friends, and maybe even the law on his side. The night outside the saloon was heavy with a pregnant silence. The moon was a sliver of bone in a black sky. The sisters held onto each other as if letting go would mean falling back into the hell they had just escaped. Arthur walked beside them, his boots crunching on the dusty street, his eyes scanning every shadow, every darkened alleyway. They reached the edge of town where his old horse, a sturdy roan named Dust Devil, waited patiently. Arthur lifted Sheer up first, her small frame shivering in the cool night air. Mai followed, her voice still trembling as she settled behind her sister. "You didn't have to do this. Now Flint will come for you, too." Arthur swung himself into the saddle and gave a small, weary shake of his head. "I've had worse men than Flint come for me. I'm still here." It was true. His voice carried the weight of years, the scars of a man who had seen too much and outlived too many storms. But deep down, a cold knot of dread tightened in his gut. This storm was different. It wasn't just his own life on the line anymore. When they reached his ranch, it looked much like the man himself, worn and tired, but solid, built to withstand the elements. A single lantern on the porch cast long, dancing shadows across the dry, packed yard. Arthur led them inside the small, Spartan cabin. He poured water from a bucket into 2 tin cups and set out a loaf of stale bread and a piece of cheese from a cupboard. The sisters ate in a desperate, famished silence, too hungry and exhausted to speak. Arthur sat across the small wooden table, watching them, the scene overlaying 1,000 memories of nights when his own Sarah had sat in that very same chair, her laughter filling the small house. The memory was a knife twisting in an old wound, but he kept the pain hidden behind a face that seemed carved from stone. Finally, after the last crumb of bread was gone, Mai broke the silence, her voice barely a whisper. "What will happen when he comes back?" Arthur leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning in protest. His eyes narrowed, focused on a point somewhere beyond the cabin wall. "Oh, he'll come. His pride won't let him do anything else." Then he looked at Mai, his gaze direct and piercing. "But when he does, he'll find he's not the only one who's ready." Sheer shifted nervously, clutching the tin cup with both hands as if it were a shield. Are you saying you'll fight them? You're just one man." Arthur let out a dry chuckle, a sound like gravel scraping rock. "Sometimes, one man with a steady hand and a clear conscience is enough." The sisters glanced at each other. For the first time since their ordeal began, a flicker of something other than fear passed between them. It was a fragile, tentative trust. The wind rattled the shutters, a lonely sound. Somewhere in the distant hills, a coyote cried out, its call echoing the desolation in Arthur's heart. The world felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. Mai lowered her voice, her dark eyes searching his. "Why us, Mr. Hayes? You don't know us. Our father, he came from across the ocean to build a new life. We are strangers here. Why risk everything for strangers?" Arthur stared into the flickering flame of the lantern on the table. The answer was heavy on his tongue, a truth he hadn't spoken in a decade. "Because for too long, I chose to stay quiet. I chose to turn away. And people I loved, they paid the price." His voice dropped, thick with unshed grief. "Not again. Not this time." The room fell silent once more. It was the kind of silence that lingers in your chest, a heavy, meaningful quiet that echoes long after the words have faded. Morning broke over the ranch with a sharp, unforgiving chill in the air. The sisters had barely slept, huddled together on a small cot, their dreams filled with shadows and cruel laughter. Arthur was already outside, feeding Dust Devil, his movement slow and methodical, as if the world had not been turned completely upside down the night before. Mai stepped onto the porch, pulling her thin shawl tight around her shoulders. The vast, empty landscape seemed to swallow her whole. "Do you really think Flint will come back today?" Arthur didn't turn, continuing to brush the horse's flank. "Flint is a man who measures his worth by the fear he inspires. Being shamed in front of his own men, in his own saloon, that's a debt he'll be eager to settle. Men like him always come back." Shia appeared in the doorway behind her sister, clutching a tin cup of coffee that was too big for her small hands. Her voice wavered. "What if he brings more men? What if he brings the law?" Arthur finally stopped, turning to look at them, his face unreadable. He looked out over the dry, sun-baked field that stretched to the horizon. "The law in this town can be bent. Sometimes it can be bought. Men like Deputy Warren have been in Flint's pocket for years. That makes them worse than outlaws. They wear a badge to hide the rot underneath." The sisters exchanged worried glances. They were safe, for the moment, but that safety felt like a thin blanket against a rising, Arctic wind. Later that morning, against Mai's protests, Arthur saddled his horse and rode into town. He left them at the ranch with strict, simple words. "Stay inside. Don't answer the door for anyone but me. If trouble comes before I'm back, head to the root cellar and stay there until it's over." The saloon was buzzing when Arthur walked in, a low hum of gossip and nervous energy. He spotted them immediately. Flint sat at his usual table with Cole, and sure enough, Deputy Warren was there too, his star pinned crookedly to his vest. His smirk was just as crooked as his soul. Well, Flint drawled, his voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. The buzz of conversation died instantly. "Look what the wind blew in. The old rancher who thinks he can play hero," he gestured to Warren. "The deputy here was just explaining to me about a debt. Seems your two little China dolls ran out on what they owed me." The crowd went quiet, all eyes on Arthur. He kept his voice steady, calm, but every word was a carefully aimed stone. "They are free. Their debt is paid. And if you or any of your men ever lay a hand on them again, you'll answer to me." Warren leaned back in his chair, tipping his hat with a sneer. "You talk big, Hayes, but you seem to forget. I carry the law in this town. And if Mr. Flint here says those girls owe him, then they owe him. That's how it works." Arthur's eyes, cold and hard as granite, locked on the deputy's. For a long, stretched-out breath, no one spoke. The weight in that silence was heavy enough to crush the air from the room. Finally, Arthur spoke, his words slow and deliberate. "Not this time. Not while I'm still breathing." The saloon stirred. A few of the patrons nodded slightly. Others looked away, not wanting to be involved. But every man and woman there felt it. A storm was coming. Flint's grin returned, sharper and more dangerous than before. "Then I guess we'll see who this town really belongs to." And with that, the line was drawn, clear as day. Arthur knew the fight had only just begun. But when Flint and the law came knocking on his door, with the whole town watching, what chance did one old cowboy really have? The day of reckoning came faster than anyone expected. By noon, a cloud of dust rose on the horizon, the unmistakable sign of riders coming hard and fast. Flint, Cole, and Deputy Warren led the charge, their faces set with an ugly, arrogant confidence. They had 4 other men with them, hard cases scraped from the darkest corners of the county. Their hands never strayed far from their weapons. Arthur stood on the porch of his ranch, his old rifle held loosely in his hands. His shoulders were square, braced against the weight of the coming storm and the ghosts of the past. Behind him, in the doorway, stood Mai and Shia. Fear was etched on their faces, but there was something else there, too. A new resolve. They were tired of running. They were ready to stand. News traveled fast in a small town. Neighbors began to gather at a safe distance, drawn by the imminent confrontation. Men and women who had suffered under Flint's thumb in silence for too long. They watched as Flint reined in his horse in Arthur's yard, shouting, pointing a finger at Arthur, calling him a thief, a liar, a man who sheltered debt dodgers. Warren trotted his horse forward, flashing his badge as if it were a holy relic. Arthur Hayes. By the authority of this county, I order you to turn over the 2 women. They are fugitives from a lawful debt. But Arthur's voice cut through the air, steady and strong, carrying across the dry yard to the onlookers. You all know the truth, he called out, his voice ringing with a conviction he hadn't felt in a decade. You've seen the bruises on others. You know what kind of men these are. The law isn't a tin badge worn by a coward. The law is supposed to be about justice. And justice has been missing from this town for far too long. The crowd murmured, a low rumble of agreement. The tide, so long stagnant, was slowly beginning to shift. Then, Mai stepped forward, out from the shadows of the doorway to stand beside Arthur. She pulled Shia with her, her hand holding her sister's tightly. Her voice shook, but it did not break. We are not the only ones they have hurt, she said, her voice clear and carrying. We are just the ones still standing to speak of it. That was enough. It was as if a dam had broken. The people found their courage, one voice at a time. An old blacksmith stepped forward. A baker's wife. A prospector Flint had cheated. One by one, they closed the distance, their silent support forming a wall around Arthur's small ranch. Flint's power, built on fear and isolation, began to crumble in the open air of truth. Warren's smirk faded as the many faces he had once bullied and ignored now turned on him, their eyes demanding real justice. By the end of that day, Flint and his men were bound with their own ropes, marched off to face a judgment from a circuit judge in a town beyond their influence. Warren, stripped of his badge by the very people he was meant to protect, was left to answer for his long and bitter history of corruption. As the dust settled and the last of the crowd dispersed, Arthur lowered his rifle. His chest was heavy with exhaustion, but his eyes were lighter than they had been in 10 long years. Mai stood beside him, her hand gently brushing against his. It wasn't a romantic touch, not yet. It was a silent promise of something new. Not just survival, but a future. And here is the lesson. One man may grow old, may carry scars, may even believe his best days are long behind him. But when he chooses to stand, when he chooses to do what is right in the face of what is wrong, he can still change everything. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is about acting even when fear is all you can feel. So let me ask you, if you were Arthur, would you have walked away from that back room, or would you have stood your ground? And if you were Mai, would you have found the strength to speak out when silence felt so much safer? These are questions worth carrying with you, long after the story fades.